welcome. We're thrilled you are joining us at this Ashby Village Arts and Culture event, Stories from the Ground, with Lauren Sandler, the ceramic artist and educator. Lauren, we're honored you're going to be educating us today. So many of you are very familiar with Ashby Village. Some may not be. We're a courageous and caring community of people transforming how we age. We support each other with vibrancy, dignity, and purpose wherever we call home. We now have over 450 members and 300 volunteers of all ages, and a dedicated network of partners and supporters. If you haven't already, I invite you, join us as a member, a volunteer, or perhaps both. Many are. We are very happy to present these kinds and this quality of programming free of charge, so it's available and accessible to everyone. If you're able to support our ability to offer free programming, we encourage you to donate to Ashby Village. Every gift makes a difference. We'll provide a donation link at the end of the webinar. You can also look for a donation link in a follow-up email. Before I turn it over to Rochelle Lefkowitz, who will introduce Lauren, I want to recognize, Lauren, you for your deep contributions to Ashby Village and to public activism. For 6 years, Rochelle has been a board member of Ashby Village, and now she's a sustaining advisor. Rochelle founded ProMedia, a social justice communications firm, which gained national media attention for successful public education campaigns, policy books, speakers, which generated headlines that have changed laws and lives. Together with our late and beloved member, Marcia Friedman, Rochelle co-founded and today chairs 2 of Ashby Village's interest groups, Arts and Culture and Elder Action. Okay, Rochelle, your turn. Take it away.
Thank you very much. And again, welcome everyone. I'm Rochelle Lefkowitz, the co-founder and chair, as was just told to you, of the Ashby Village Arts and Culture series. We're a wide-ranging exploration of the arts and culture, and we've operated for 7 years for free to the larger East Bay community and beyond. I'm here this afternoon to introduce a nationally acclaimed artist whose awe-inspiring work in ceramics, through her lens of anthropology, I have long admired. Remember as a child how clay felt on your fingers and palms? You'd poke it and pick it up and squeeze it and put it down, and each time the clay responded. Clay is a layered and complex material, and I've come to learn from Lauren that from the paleolithic figurines in museums to the cups on our kitchen tables, clay offers us a rare chance to address a broad range of social, economic, racial, political, and environmental issues, and to explore experiences that may, on their surface, seem irreconcilable, like permanence and impermanence, stability and instability. Wherever she has lived, ceramicist Lauren Sandler, who is now the head of Temple University's Tyler School of Art and Architecture in Philadelphia, considers the clay around her. And rather than simply extract the clay beneath the surface of the city, she and her students harvest it from creeks, vacated lots, and construction sites. And then, to find out, here's Lauren, whose work is currently on exhibit at the Philadelphia airport from now through February. This afternoon, she comes to us on Zoom to generously share her observations and a selection of the clay vessels that she's created. And now I am both pleased and proud to present to you Lauren Sandler.
Hello. Thank you so much, Rochelle. I assume you all can hear me okay?
We can.
Okay, great. Thank you for your generous introduction, and all of you for being here today. I appreciate the invitation to speak with you all. hold on, I'm just getting rid of a few things on my screen. Okay, there we are. So I am going to talk with you all today a bit about my work, my practice as an artist, but also speak to you really more broadly about my thinking and my interests, particularly in the material or with the material of clay, and kind of how I approach that within my broader creative practice. And I'll also speak about some other projects, collaborative projects that I do. A little bit of background, as Rochelle mentioned, I came to ceramics really through my first undergraduate degree, which is in anthropology, and that study very much shaped my foundational thinking of clay, which is first and foremost a cultural material, and that grounding very much inspired my fascination with the material. A material that is all around us, as Rochelle mentioned, from paleolithic figurines to being used in biomedical implants, as the image on the left there shows, to bricks that were made by enslaved people to build the White House, one of which those bricks is in that center image. It is the earth from which we harvest our food. It is that ubiquitous cup on our kitchen table. This material permeates our lives, and that pervasiveness, for me, creates a familiarity and an intimacy. And as an artist, it's an access point to address multiple themes, social, personal, political themes in one's work. Clay, it's an archival material. And I think that too allows for a very tangible, but also symbolic connection to other eras, people, cultures, and so on. And clay, I think of it as a material that it tells stories, through looking at clay objects, certainly through studying ceramics, as I did, and teaching ceramics, as I also do. I think we unearth those stories, stories of community, stories of change. And so often in my work and my practice, I'm looking to artifacts and material culture as a means of dismantling and reconstructing narratives. And so some central questions that guide my work are who's in the clay, and who tells the stories, what stories are untold, and how are narratives written in this material, and what are the ways through which stories manifest. And this last image here on the right is a clay vessel that I made from locally dug clay, which I'll talk about a little bit more in a bit. So I'm particularly interested in those layered and complex stories that are held in objects. And I think of ceramics, or I think of my work in some way, as this kind of shared intersection of body, of culture, and of history. And so in my current work, I am constructing vessels as an accumulation of parts in which I build with stacked objects that can be assembled and disassembled. And in this video here, I'm disassembling one of these objects. And I like how this process of assembling and disassembling, putting something together and taking it apart is for me both a physical but a symbolic means of constructing and deconstructing something. And so that potential mutability of a form for me is a way to explore kind of shifting of meaning and narratives. And then I also adorn these vessels with this kind of obsessive detail to create a type of kind of visual abundance. And I think of that abundance as for me, it's really a kind of a tactic of a sort of ornamental allure to hopefully challenge the presumptive neutrality often of the objects and images in the material culture that I'm looking at and thinking about. This is just a still image of that piece in that video. And for me, I think of the vessel is really, it's a reference to a body, as it is for many, I think, ceramic artists. But for me, I think of the vessel, it can be reference of individual bodies, collective bodies, governing bodies, bodies of land, bodies of evidence. And so with this piece here, it is covered, and all of these pieces I'll start with, they're all ceramic, all of the bits and pieces. There's some later pieces that I'll show and I'll specify that have other materials, but these are all ceramic. And it's covered with different types of maritime objects. And I was thinking about migrations and commodification of goods, of people, economies of trade, occupation. And so this is covered with, the objects on here are hooks and weights and bobbers and knots. So representing sea movement, movement of people and goods and culture and so on. And so this, for me, the vessel form, or I use the vessel form for that accessibility and recognition that that offers. And hopefully, I hope that familiarity, if you will, acts as an entry point to intrigue a kind of closer examination of the objects, and to hopefully invite more of a curiosity to explore the layers of context of these objects. And so this piece is covered with coffee beans, and it's hung. The hung elements are cacao and soybeans, and with this, I was really thinking about labor and violence of historic and contemporary agricultural production. And although I refer to these objects as vessels quite purposefully to imply utility, they're not functional. I don't consider them functional. Each part is bottomless and stacked, as that video shows. They're not, they don't have a bottom. Essentially, you can look through the entire piece. And that, removing any bottom, really, it removes them from their ability to actually contain, so as to hopefully focus more on different stories or myths or histories of the goods that are often held or preserved in a ceramic vessel. And so rather than a coffee pot or a teapot or a sugar bowl, the pieces focus more on the goods that are often contained in a more familiar ceramic object. And so with this piece, I was thinking about salt. This is a large salt cellar. This piece is probably, I don't know, about 1.5 feet wide from left to right. And thinking about salt, a material with a vast social, religious significance. Salt has medicinal purposes. It's been used for preservation, for protest. Wars have been financed and fought over salt. And I was looking at, part of my research with this piece was looking at these extravagant salt cellars of the Renaissance era. And those objects very much signified prestige and social hierarchy. And so this piece is a large salt cellar, and it's covered with tricone and auger bits, so objects of the mining process. And the palette are colors representing a variety of types of salt. So considering this long history and contemporary role of salt as this layered cultural material and commodity. And so with this object, I was referencing the sort of cultural and geographical movement of objects through the samovar. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the samovar. It is a container that is used to boil water. More often it is made out of metal than ceramic. So it's used to boil water for tea. We see these with a vast history, particularly in Eastern Europe and many parts of West Asia as well. And my samovar is hung with tea bricks and sugarcane. And as a ceramic artist, I've always been a bit resistant to teapots, not using teapots, but making them. I think there's a certain expectation of making teapots. And so this is my way of kind of reflecting on tea, but outside the tradition of a traditional teapot, as I'm thinking more about the global movement of tea and sugar as a colonial and imperial commodity through the object of the samovar. And so my my mother's side of the family is from Sicily. And so with this object, I was doing some research and thinking about the sort of layered history of Sicily. Sicily, a area of land that went through many different rulers over the centuries, from Carthaginians, North Africa, to Muslim rule, Greek, Norman rule, and each phase of ruler would bring different foods, different objects, goods, symbols, and so on through that land, many of which are often identified now as Sicilian. But I was thinking about, like, what does that even mean to be identified as Sicilian with that history? And so with this vessel, I was thinking about that kind of complex migration of objects through Sicily across histories and geographies as a way to kind of interrupt this sort of mythic belief in this kind of legacy of an exceptionalized monoculture, to kind of challenge that. And so with this object, it is covered with wheat with origins in North Africa, pine cones are symbols that we see in ancient Egypt, Babylon, and Greece, pistachios with a Middle East origin, and lemons, which are, I was looking at these very popular, well-known ceramic objects, Sicilian ceramic objects from the time of the Arab domination. And then the handles are an abstracted sugarcane, which was grown in Sicily over 1,000 years ago, and sugarcane, significant history of that material, world's largest crop by production at one point, established a market of enslaved labor, and so on. And so again, sort of thinking about how these objects kind of refute neutrality, and tell a much more layered and complicated history of Sicily. And so a lot of the work the images of my work that I've shown up until this point began a number of years ago with research that actually led me to this object here on the left. It's called a Lacanus pot from Centeripe, Sicily, the region where my mother's family is from. The image on the right is a detail of what the lid would have more accurately looked like as far as its color. And so these objects were created in Centeripe, Sicily for just a short period of time, in this period of 100 years. There's not that much written on them, and part of that is probably they were made in this one town for a short period of time. There's not that many that really exist in museum collections. Some believe that they were made for women and marked life transitions of marriage, death, signifying both sacred and mundane use. But really part of my research that led to me kind of coming across these objects began with conversations I was having with students about appropriation in ceramics. And we were talking about thinking about what we look at as artists, or the things we look at or reference in our work, and how our personal relationship with those reference objects impact the content of the work. How certain power dynamics may be established depending upon who one is and what the work is that maybe we're looking at or thinking about or referencing in our practice. And so those conversations really led me to do some research on objects from my own cultural lineage. And so through that, I came across this object. And initially what brought my attention to them was really, in part, I find them to have a certain visual awkwardness. And I think that in part is because the foot, the sort of bottom bowl part, the lid and the finial are all separate. They are stacked one part on top of another, creating, I think, a certain oddness of form. And that this is what got me thinking about how a vessel could be stacked and assembled, as opposed to maybe how one might create an object with a composite object, if you will, in ceramics, which is by kind of slipping and scoring, like fusing them, attaching them so they cannot be disassembled. Also, I had never seen these before. I was very curious about them. And then given the kind of connection to my family background, I just became extremely intrigued by these objects. And that led to doing further consideration of objects from antiquity, from ancient Rome, from ancient Greece, such as this figurative marble statue on the left there. On the right is a rendition a remake of it, if you will, that showed more accurately what it likely the surface looked like. And so when objects like this were depicted during the Renaissance era, they were presented as monochromatic objects, when they were in fact, as we know, as this part on the right, the piece on the right shows, they were polychromatic, and they were embellished with painting and gilding and silver and inlay. You know, they had a lot of color, as those centuripe objects did as well. And so there was this constructed mythology of these sculptures, such as this one here, as white, which was established and proliferated in the 18th and 19th centuries, really as a way to equate racial whiteness with beauty. But the reality was that you can be of, you know, really the reality of ancient Rome was that you could be Roman and be Judean or Ethiopian or Spanish or German or Egyptian and so on. And so this image on the bottom here, this is a fresco from Pompeii, Italy. And I think this shows how ancient Rome did not construct difference through the language of race and biology and skin color as we do now. And the belief that ancient Greeks and Romans are this, you know, kind of foundation of kind of a white and Western civilization that belongs to white people is false and is part of this misrepresentation of histories. And I think about how those false representations of antiquity and the classics are often perpetuated in our classrooms and museums through disciplines of art and art history. The image on the top here is a tombstone, a Sicilian tombstone, that I think really, I love this image because it shows this presence of a multi-ethnic past Sicily, as I was talking about, where we have on this tombstone Latin on the left, Greek on the right, Hebrew on top, and Arabic on the bottom. And so I show that some of these images really as to give a bit more of a background into my thinking and research that preceded or led to this body of work that I'm sharing with you today. And so when I began making objects that were inspired by that centuripe Lacanus pot and the subsequent research that I'm sharing with you, that's when I began this process of covering these vessels with objects. In part, it was a way to emulate that embellishment of color, of imagery, but it was also a way for me to kind of create different stories that I wanted to tell with the different objects that I was covering the pieces with. And through that process is really how I began thinking more about material culture, which is really essentially, you know, the things that make up our lives, the objects that make up our lives. And this is kind of a good example of that. You know, this piece of mine, it started with a more personal connection or personal object, the button. And I come from a family of Italian and Jewish immigrants who both sides of my family came to New York 2 or 3 generations ago. All of my grandparents were essentially laborers. My mother's mother was a seamstress. My father's father was a sewing machine operator. He made hats for a period of time. And so I was looking at a lot of the objects from textile work, and this piece is covered with ceramic buttons that I made, and I was looking at a collection of buttons that I have in my home that are actually part of my from my partner's family, but also signifying a similar culture and background, a Jewish immigrant family. And so the piece is covered with buttons and hung with spools, nails, and knots. And so I was thinking about this accumulation of diasporic material and how that is passed on or forgotten or disrupted or erased. And so how these objects are objects of attachment, but they are also loaded with contradictions of effect, as connections can bind, piercings can mend, and ties can restrict. The next couple of pieces I'm showing you is when in these objects, I'm starting to use other materials. The bulk, the larger parts of this form are ceramic, but essentially all of the hanging elements are not ceramic. They are the objects that I'm referencing. And so these next couple of ones, they're much larger. These are, I guess I should say, most of the pieces that I've been showing you up until this point have been 2.5 to 3 feet tall. Whereas these next couple of objects are, they're over 5 feet tall, about 5.5 feet tall. And so they're a bit larger and starting to work with some different materials. I have some details of that piece here, so you can maybe get a little bit more sense of what's going on in them. And so this piece is really, for me, a continuation of that button piece, the objects of attachment. And so this is hung with buttons, real buttons now, and other objects and materials connected to textile work, including spools and thimbles and bobbins, and also clothing. And in this piece, really just continuing to reflect on the lives and labor of my Italian and Jewish immigrant family, who, as I said, labored in various elements of textile work. And so with a lot of my work, I'm often also thinking about ideas and acts of extraction. But that can be extraction of materials, but also extraction of culture, extraction of labor, of knowledge, of objects, of narratives. And so with this piece, I was thinking about extraction of clay and clay adjacent materials in the mining, collecting, and processing of clay. And metals that are often used in ceramic art practices, but also in industries and goods that are often produced utilizing clay, such as paper and rubber. We may not think about it, but there are clay materials in other materials that we use, such as clay and rubber. And so the glazes, any glazes that I'm using in this piece, are made with cobalt and nickel and copper. And the hanging elements are paper and rubber, and the paper that I'm using this are papers that I dyed with those same materials, cobalt, nickel, and copper. And then the bricks of this piece and the piece prior that I showed you images of, the one just before this, are bricks that are made with clay, bricks that I made from clay that I harvested in Philadelphia. And so with this piece is a way for me to touch upon this sort of long global and local practice of extraction as consumption, whether for control, for profit, for power, or just for our own goods and needs. And so the bricks that you can maybe kind of see here, many of the bricks I have this sort of W stamp that I stamped all the bricks with this sort of entwined W that I created. The W represents Wadsworth Avenue, which is the street that I live on in Philadelphia, named after colonial settlers in this area. And for Wissahickon, which is a creek in my neighborhood named after the Lenni Lenape people, the indigenous people of this area. And these are the two places where I dug the clay to make the bricks to represent the history of this area that I live. And these are a couple of images. As Rochelle said in my introduction, I currently have an exhibition and installation up in the Philadelphia International Airport. These are some of those images of that installation. It's called Whose Testimonies Our Vessels Carry. And the installation has many of the pieces that I've shown you today, along with a few others that address these sort of histories of Philadelphia. The large centerpiece that's in that bottom image there, which is called Invasive Species, looks at past industries of Philadelphia, including agriculture, textiles, and clay, as a way to consider the impact of colonial settler history in this region. And these are just a few detail shots so you can see a little bit more closely. The pedestals of the smaller pieces that I've been showing you, as you can see them here, are the pedestals were inspired by old Philadelphia sewage pipes that I love that you just kind of come across in walking throughout Philadelphia. Sometimes you'll kind of see an old exposed ceramic sewage pipe. And I've decorated my sewage pipes with various processes and surfaces like slip trailing and imagery that are inspired by different historic regional ceramics. So I'm going to kind of switch here a bit from talking about some of the objects that I make to some more of my research that has come out of my studio practice and my thinking and my teaching. So as I've been, sharing with you, I think a lot about how clay contains a lot of, global, social, economic content and context. And to me, that's, what is so fascinating about this material. It's what makes it so compelling to work with. And that interest has led to, for me, a particular fascination for a number of years now with bricks, and I've shared with you a little bit about some of the, brick making I shared in those images that I just shared a moment ago. But I've been fascinated with bricks and the sort of content and history that these objects hold. Bricks build homes for shelter, roads that connect, hearths to cook food, that nourish our bodies, vessels to bury the dead. And bricks also construct borders and walls and towers to imprison, to enclose, to exclude. As I mentioned, I live in Philadelphia, and for 2 centuries, Philadelphia was America's preeminent brick-making city. And it was because of the abundance of local clay that allowed for brick making to flourish in this region, and bricks to become one of the most important building materials in this area. The clay in this area was so extensive that even after 2 centuries of mining the material, it still provided enough clay to produce more than over 200 million bricks a year by the end of the 19th century. This image here that I'm showing you, this is my house. This is the side of my house. I live in a brick home, as many of us in Philadelphia do. And I love these bricks for their irregularity of shape and color. And these, I believe, would have been called blackhead bricks. And that is because, for those who are familiar with ceramics and maybe different firing techniques, these bricks would have been located in the firebox of a wood-fired kiln. And in that placement of a kiln, they are most directly exposed to the fire. And so that heat, that intensity of heat causes these irregularities, and also makes them the most vitrified of the bricks in the kiln. And so because of that, these would have been considered seconds, and would have been used, and just as they're used in my home, this is the side of my house, not the facade. The facade are these beautiful other bricks and stones, but they're used on the facade because they would have been considered less beautiful and very well vitrified, so very functional. So a little bit more of the history of bricks in this area. This is, so by the early 1900s, Pennsylvania, led by Philadelphia, was second in the nation as a producer of clay products, just behind Ohio. But it ranked first in the country for bricks. And this is an image from probably around early 1800s of a city plan of a main section of Philadelphia, and those sort of bold lines are all brickyards. Those are all kiln. Those bold lines denote kilns and brickyards. So you can see the center of the city was inundated with kilns and brickyards. And so I'm really interested in the context that created that industry and that history, which is also, especially where I am, this is a history of settler colonial history of America and American capitalism. But this, for me to be thinking about bricks as I do, I'm also thinking about this sort of production of bricks and this vast history that certainly precedes the history of Philadelphia. And so to think about that, I also have to discuss bricks today, and this sort of larger global brick production, particularly in India and China, that has this enormous unregulated industry of bonded laborers in brick production. This here is an image of a kiln in China, which is the world's largest producer of bricks. And those are two laborers washing themselves in that kind of bottom right corner of the image. And so throughout many parts of Asia, people make bricks to supply towns that are being transformed by global corporate demand for housing and factories and technology, making what is referred to as blood bricks. But these oppressive labor practices happen in this country as well. This is an image from an article from The Guardian about 5 or 6 years ago. The article is called "Still a City of Slaves, Selma in the Words of Those Who Live There." And so this is a story about Selma, Alabama. At the time of the writing of this piece, women earned about $10 to collect a pile of 500 bricks from old structures. And so these repurposed bricks are used as architectural details in new homes and buildings. And so this is essentially talking about how this contemporary slave labor practice profits from the work of Black women. And so from the rubble of this being an old cotton warehouse, women remove the bricks from the piles, remove the mortar from the bricks, and stack them into new piles. And so these bricks that were handmade bricks from the 1800s, likely made by enslaved people, now in great demand, embody women enslaved twice, as they are minimally paid for bricks that are later sold for a much higher price. And these are just, this image here, just two more examples of kind of contemporary roles of bricks or building objects. The image on the left is from Freedmanstown in Houston, Texas. And this is the remains of a Yoruba patterned road that was laid by formerly enslaved people when the city refused their request to pave the streets. Over the years, these roads have been pulled up or paved over, but in more recent years, after protests from residents, some of these bricks have been relaid. And the image on the right is these bricks made from recycled rubble and coal dust of destroyed buildings in Gaza, and they are called green cake, and they were created by 2 women engineering graduates from the Islamic University of Gaza. And so I'm really interested in how, we can look to these objects, bricks, and also ceramic objects more broadly, and materials for information, for discussion, and for action. I think about how more often clay and other materials that really we depend upon and use every day in our lives are extracted from the land and place and processed and shipped away from its location and sold and used by people in industry. Often many of us with very little understanding and connection to where it came from and how it comes to us. And often, the labor and the lives are involved in the collecting and the processing and the distribution of the material. This is an image from my street where one morning I woke up to jackhammering happening outside my house. And I looked outside and I saw this huge hole in the ground and this pile of dirt that they were, pulling out the dirt and just putting creating this huge pile. And so, as a ceramic artist, I was immediately intrigued by that. And so I went outside with a bucket and a shovel and asked if I could have some of this, and they were fine with that. And I was really just curious to see what is this material underneath my house and my road. And this was the beginning of me collecting clay in and around Philadelphia. And in Philadelphia, as with many cities, but particularly in Philadelphia, there's enormous amounts of construction in this city. I see it as a certain parallel to of growth in the city that to the kind of during the time of the sort of the colonial settlers of the 18th and 19th centuries, where there was a lot of this sort of speculative development, and neighborhoods completely changing over the course of a very short period of time, where you see that now, you know, a decade later, and a neighborhood is completely different than it was. And so I just, in the back of my car, I always have buckets and shovels. And so when I'm driving to work or just driving and doing errands, I will often see a hole being dug for new housing or construction. And I will just ask if I can take some of that material, and I take it back to my studio and I do some testing and I work with it. And as I began using this material in my own practice, you know, this extracted material that I'm collecting around Philadelphia, often to make bricks, I became really more interested in using this as a way to connect with different communities and neighborhoods where I live. And so rather than go out alone and extract this material for my own use and purpose, it felt more meaningful to kind of collectively find, process, and work with local clays, with people who live in that place. And then for us together to reflect on this layered history contained in the earth and connect us to that place and to that history and to our personal and collective stories, as well as the contemporary life of the communities that this clay comes from. And these are just a few images of a recent workshop I did at a local community garden here in Philadelphia, where we made bricks together. We processed the clay together and we made bricks. And we're going to be in the spring, since we're kind of we've hit winter now, I'm going to fire these bricks, and then in the spring we will lay down a path, or we'll do something with these bricks together in this community garden where the clay came from. And this is just a short video. This is a short video that I put together that shows this whole process. This is me with a group of students last year, where we harvested clay from various places, different locations throughout the city. We prepared and processed this material. You can see us here prepping the material. Made wooden molds, which is very traditional old ways of making bricks. Made a variety of types of brick shapes. And then from those bricks, we made a path. And we have a beautiful dye garden at my school where I teach. This is us kind of working outside in the dye garden. And we constructed this path in the dye garden. And we have impressions in these bricks of some of the native plants that are growing in that garden. And this is just an image of the students and the path that they made from start, you know, from finding the clay to making the bricks to laying the garden. You know, and it was this really lovely, meaningful way, I think, to learn and explore the complexities of this material within this frame of local history and its connection to, you know, global production, old and new, through this material, and also this very specific particular object of the brick. You know, and so a lot of my work is, you know, looking to the past through objects, through material and the stories, as a way really to reflect and contemplate and make connections to our contemporary world and lives. And I think about the pervasiveness and familiarity, as I mentioned earlier, and it's such a compelling material to use as this bridge because of that, I think, familiarity. You know, every culture in the world has a relationship to clay, you know, and I love how I can hold this material in my hand that carries a global history and tells the story of place in all of its complexities. And I think of ceramics as a site, an act of resilience and resistance, of criticism and of commentary, and a material really with the capability to create objects and experiences that are loaded to address very large, sweeping, broad, but also very specific themes and ideas and actions. Thank you. I think if it's okay, I'll stop sharing so we can kind of, maybe you can see me in a better way, and I'm maybe not such a small poster size or small little size. Is that better? Can you all see me a little bit better now? Okay.
Okay, that
So
was
thank you for listening. I'm
That was-
happy to.
presentation, Lauren. That was really wonderful. I mean, so special and so yeah, really special. And I particularly liked actually at the end that brick path. I mean, in that community garden. I mean, what a wonderful idea. And yeah, make it so personal. Yeah, really.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I'm really enjoying that. And you know, there's so many wonderful community gardens throughout this city. And so it's something that I'm slowly kind of trying to build a larger practice, or this way where I can kind of take this throughout the city to different community gardens and do this with different people as a way for us to kind of work with this material together and reflect on its history.
It's wonderful. It's really, really great. There was one question Marsha asked. She said, let's see, are all the objects attached to the form made by you of clay? As a first-time lover of ceramics and ditto as viewer of your work, I need a bit more guidance on the topic of what, in parentheses, the bean vessel apart, what I'm looking at. Please, can you explain?
Absolutely. Yes, all of those, like that beans piece, for example, is all made out of clay. I made all of the individual parts. And the only pieces that incorporated materials and objects that were not ceramic made out of clay were those last bits where I said these were a little bit larger. But all of those first series of smaller objects, they're made out of clay and they're handmade. So that beans piece, when I said it's covered in coffee beans, that means I made, I don't know, thousands of little handmade coffee beans to scale and attached it to the clay surface. And then the other beans that are kind of hung, kind of like jewelry, you know, hung around the piece, the cacao beans and soybeans, those two are handmade ceramic clay objects that I'm just forming by hand. And then I fire them in the kiln, and then I assemble the piece, you know, and I assemble the hanging elements. I'm just using like jewelry wire, you know, and making essentially like necklaces, if you will. And then I'm adorning the piece with those pieces, with those parts. I hope that makes sense.
Another comment here. Thank you so much. So amazingly great. For 2 decades, I've been teaching kids hand building in my driveway. I have kilns in my garage. I live in California, so we are year round. I can't wait to tell them about you. So
Wonderful.
Quite a few comments, truly amazing. Thank you indeed. And that was actually from Marsha, who said, thank you for your answer to her question. And another comment, so glad this is being recorded. I look forward to sharing it with my friends. And I have one question. I don't quite understand what are you testing for? Yeah.
What am I testing for? Meaning like when I was, I don't know if they're referring to when I started like testing, when I maybe dig clay, perhaps that. Well, what I'm doing is I'm testing the quality of the material. And what I mean by that is, you know, there's a lot of different types of clay. I mean, for example, like the difference of porcelain to terracotta, you know, some obvious differences are color, but there's other material differences, the temperature that we fire them to, what they feel like. I'm going to use a different type of clay for maybe an outdoor sculpture or a large sculpture than I might for a small handmade cup or for a cup. So the clay that I'm digging, I'm testing to get a sense of its workability. And so that means like its plasticity, how it feels, how high can I fire it before it just melts and becomes just not, you know, it doesn't hold itself up anymore. what do glazes look like on it? That's what I'm doing. I'm familiarizing myself with that material and what it can do potentially as a material to create different types of objects. I also do test them for any materials that I don't want to be working with, like certain toxic materials, because I'm in the middle of a city. Well, not even just being in the middle of a city, but I'm digging these up from under the roads. I don't know what also other toxic, or if there's lead in these materials. There is sometimes. And so when I'm extracting clay and digging clay from maybe a new location in the city, I will send that out and get tested. And so I will get like is there arsenic, is there lead, and other types of materials to tell me like, maybe I don't want to be working with this, or maybe I don't want to be firing this in my kiln in my home studio, and so on. So I'm also testing them for their safety as well.
What did the airport hope to show with your work?
What did they hope to show? I don't know. They knew what they were getting, I guess. I mean, I don't know. They just, I think they were interested in, some of that work I made new for the airport show, but some of that work was already made. And they just reached out to me, and that they have that large case, as I showed you, and they said, will you fill this? And I said, sure. And that was that, really.
Do you add any materials to the clay you harvest?
I don't, for the objects that I'm making, because I'm making bricks, and those are very forgiving. That's a very forgiving object. It would be different if I were making maybe larger hollow forms. I've been meaning to throw on the wheel with some of the clay that I've dug, and I just haven't gotten around to it, because I do throw parts of my objects. If I wanted to make different types of objects with the clay, I may add other materials to probably just to make it a little bit more plastic, meaning plasticity is the thing that makes it stand up, essentially, without just like falling over. And some of the clays that I dig are, they have other stuff in them, like larger particles, like, sand, more of the grain of a sand, which is a much larger grain, which doesn't, the difference of like, if you took sand and wet that and try to make a shape with that, it's not going to hold its shape. That's because of the particle size. As a clay, it's a very, very fine particle, which allows clay to hold shape. So depending on what I may want to do, I may add other materials that assist in that plasticity, but I haven't yet. I use it straight from the earth. I'll just take out, if there's bits of, stones and wood, and detritus, I just pick that out. I add water, I wedge it up to make it a bit more homogeneous, and that's it. And I make things with it.
I guess that also answers the next question. Are you just adding water and sand to prepare it?
That's it.
So
I keep it really, really simple. Yeah.
Someone else said, in our geographic area, we have soil which is heavily clay-based and makes it difficult to plant our gardens.
Yes.
Yes. This bias has influenced attitude about clay-impacted soil. Any suggestion to appreciate this aspect of clay in our flower-based gardens?
Yeah.
Presentation, and found it very, very thought-provoking.
Thank you. We have the same problem here. It was because of the abundance of clay. Yes, I am a gardener as well. I became a gardener when I moved to Philadelphia, because particularly there's just such a wonderful culture here of gardening, especially in my neighborhood. It's really beautiful what people do with their little small areas, but it makes it really challenging to grow things. It's very clay heavy. I guess that means you can, use that to make the containers, and maybe make containers for your garden. Rather than, I use a lot of, in my garden, I plant I have like more like shrubbery and things, and then I do a lot of my flower and vegetable gardens in containers. So I guess you can use your local clay to make the containers.
So somebody else actually, with regard to the airport, says the airport is showing the real base of Philly. That is a comment, so
Yeah.
to that. And also Philadelphia airport has great art, much appreciated when I have been stranded there, and glad you're represented.
Yeah. Those who do fly through Philadelphia, it's a wonderful program that's been over 20 years. They have a lot of art, and it's essentially all regional artists. So it's a really wonderful way to see regional art.
And one of our actually arts and culture team members said, "I'm a potter and I would love to throw with your clay."
Yeah, I and it's interesting, depending on where I dig it, some of it is super plastic. Those of you who work with clay know what I mean. And I can pick, that's why I think I do have some that I can throw with. I just haven't found the time, but it's so wonderfully plastic right from the ground in this one spot that I found. In other areas, it's super grainy, and I just have to do it. I just haven't, it's been something that's been on my list of things to get to but I'm curious to see what it will be like and what it will look like.
Here's another comment. Thank you for illustrating the presence of colored sculpture in ancient Greek and Roman art, and for highlighting Roman civilizations embracing many ethnic groups.
Yeah, I thank you. I think when we think about that history more, I think in that context, I think that it reveals a lot. And it also reveals a lot about many of our disciplines that many of us were brought up and through, and the things perhaps that we were not taught, or the stories that we were not told through those disciplines. Yeah.
I guess that is all the comments and questions we. Oh, actually, there's something else. I'm a teacher, and I loved how you worked with students from the original material to the final beautiful pathway. So,
thank you. It's a wonderful way of working with students. I mean, I'm working with college students, but I mean, you can do this with a range of ages and backgrounds. It's not even people who. It's also a wonderful way to teach people about the material, as those of us who teach ceramics do, because you get to understand it not just like as this thing that comes in a bag, and is often pre-mixed for us, but like, oh, this is where this material comes from, and the processing that is involved in getting this to our studios and to our classrooms. I think it really opens that up and expands their thinking about it in wonderful ways. So it's a fun project to do with students.
I can also see actually children be totally fascinated by
it. And I have done things like in these kind of community spaces, when I'm working with different groups and communities. I mean, what happens, there'll sometimes be children there, and they, it's like, you put something plastic in their hands and they're just engaged, and just naturally start to create little sculptures. And so I'm also wanting to, work, with communities and all the different people that live in a community, and find ways to bring the things that a child will do with that and other things, and kind of make those into maybe different types of sculptures or parts of shared community space.
I have one last comment here, actually, from Veronica. We don't appreciate soil as much as we should. Too often we cover it over and don't realize that it is an important source of so much. I mean, I have to mention, I know Veronica, who actually who said that, and she is a master gardener, so
Yes.
And, another comment, I just viewed a very comprehensive program about Etruscans, many urns from the 18th century BC, and also Sicilian connections from Etruria. Urns had resemblance to early work that you shared.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah. Yes.
Okay, thank you so very much again, Lauren. It was wonderful. And yeah, I will definitely look at your website. It's so interesting.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And I appreciate the invitation. And yeah, if anyone wants to reach out or has questions, I shared at the end. I think I might have seen it somewhere also in the chat, maybe earlier, either my email or something like that. I try to share images of the things that I'm doing for those who use social media. I shared my Instagram as well. It's just my, what is it? I think it's my, what is it? It's Lauren Sandler Studio, which is also my website. So feel free to follow me there. And I like to share the things that I'm doing, just the different projects, either within my own practice or with community groups and things like that.
Thank you very much. And now back to Rochelle, who has some final comments.
Well, thank you, Sigrid, and thank you so much, Lauren. I think I speak for all of us here today when I say how grateful I am for everything I've learned this afternoon, from how you think about stories of community and change, and the layered history that you lay out for us about ceramic articles telling us how, and how they really refute the neutrality that they are often given in museums or classrooms. And I feel like you certainly opened my eyes and transformed how I'm going to look at pottery and other ceramics that I encounter. You've inspired me to find out about, gosh, everything from the equating of racial whiteness to beauty, to the complex migration of objects and people, to the buttons in my own family. So just as it does to spark creativity, it really takes a village to produce a meaningful and enlightening quarterly arts and cultural event like the one we've just had today. In addition to expressing our gratitude to our speaker, Lauren Sandler, I want to thank the hardworking members of the Ashby Village Arts and Culture Group, including Sigrid Duisberg, who, once again, I'd like to thank for her masterful job of managing your thoughtful questions. Thanks to Irene Marcos and to Ronnie Saslow for their tireless outreach to you all, including the Berkeley Potters Guild folks who joined us today, and to our newest members, Elizabeth Hutchins and former Potter Myra Kaplan, who continue to contribute to our work with their new energy and ideas. Thanks also to Ashby Village's Executive Director, Bab Freiberg, for your warm Ashby Village welcome that set just the right tone for this afternoon's presentation. And to Ashby Village staff members, Charisse Hanshaw and Jessica Sterling, for your considerable communications and tech support for our event this afternoon. For over 7 years now, we've been committed to bringing you high-quality, memorable presentations. All of our arts and culture events are free, but we hope if you enjoyed today's event as much as I did, you're going to consider making a donation to help us continue to offer more exceptional events like today's. Find the donation link in your invitation to the event or at the top of our website, ashbyvillage.org. I want to remind you to watch for the upcoming December issue of our newsletter, the Ashby Village Voices, for news of our next arts and culture event. Please RSVP early and then invite a good friend to join you the next time. So thank you for joining us on this glorious early autumn afternoon to celebrate changing our clocks by changing our perspectives about ceramics.